Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 11th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies lecture series. The theme of the series this year is Curing Illness with Good Deeds in Chinese Buddhism. Today is the second lecture of the series, and we are very happy and honored to have invited Professor Stephen F. Teiser again to share with us his insight and wisdom. The topic for today's lecture is Rituals of Merit and Confession. Before the lecture begins, I'd like to invite Professor Catherine Hardy from the Hong Kong Youth Center of Buddhist Studies to introduce Professor Teiser. Professor Hardy, please.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming this evening. It is my honor to introduce Professor Teiser, who is the 11th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies here at the University of Hong Kong. He is also the D.T. Suzuki Professor in Buddhist Studies and a Professor of Religion at Princeton University. So Professor Teiser teaches Buddhism, the religions of China, and approaches to the study of religion at Princeton University. He's interested in how Buddhism was practiced and understood by people from all walks of life in pre-modern Asia. His books on China consider popular celebrations like the Ghost Festival in medieval China, as well as concepts and rituals of the afterlife, such as his book, The Scripture on the Ten Kings and the Making of Purgatory, and also ritual practice, one publication here being Ritual and the Study of Buddhism in Chinese. He's also written on paintings of Buddhist cosmology, one publication, Reinventing the Wheel, Paintings of Rebirth in Medieval Buddhist Temples. He's edited books on Buddhist literature and translated work on the Dunhuang corpus. His publications have garnered numerous awards, including the Prix Stanislas Julien from the Institut de France. So here tonight, as Carol said, we are here for the second of Professor Teiser's lectures, which is part of the 11th Mama Charitable Foundation lecture series in Buddhist studies. The topic of Professor Teiser's lecture this evening is Curing Illness with Good Deeds in Chinese Buddhism. Buddhist sutras promise many benefits for good deeds, and throughout history, Buddhists have dedicated merit to alleviating sickness. How is the mechanism of transferring merit supposed to work? How is the process of healing conceptualized? What types of illness can be cured? Medieval handwritten liturgies used in the performance of rituals surviving among the Dunhuang manuscripts provide answers to these questions. This lecture series considers cultures of healing in pre-modern China, rituals practiced by local monks on behalf of donors, rich and poor, rites of merit-making and confession, and the dynamics of curing individual illnesses and epidemics. So please join me in a warm welcome of Professor Teiser. Please.
I hope everyone is staying warm. I appreciate you all coming out on such an unseasonably cold day and during a cold stretch. I want to warm up my voice a little bit and make sure the sound is okay. So anyone having problems, either too loud or too soft at this point? Okay, I'll keep on going, and if you have any problems, please let me know. Thank you very much, Professor Hardy, for the kind introduction. I extend my thanks to the sponsors, the Mama Charitable Foundation, and to the Center of Buddhist Studies at Hong Kong U. It's my honor to be here at Hong Kong U, which has had a very long and very distinguished program in Buddhist studies. As you can see, there are 3 lectures in this series, and this is the middle one. It's in some ways it's the most technical and the most difficult to jump into, because I'm going to run through the steps of the liturgical sequence of the process of curing with karma. My lecture on Friday, the 26th, will get to the conclusion, really, and that's to look at how curing takes place. But today I'm going to look at how the actual rituals are configured. My lecture on where are we now? We're already Monday the 22nd, my lecture on Friday the 19th, very briefly covered the variety of concepts of healing in traditional China. I ran through the process of the making of merit, which I'm going to review briefly tonight. And I looked at the variety of methods used for curing, not only Buddhist methods based on the transfer of merit, but also rituals of Taoism, rituals performed by barefoot mediums, and rituals, and acts of curing performed by doctors of traditional Chinese medicine using acupuncture and moxibustion. Today, as I said, I'm going to look at the process of making merit. Then I'm going to introduce the body of materials that I'm working with today, and also largely in my third lecture. These are liturgical manuscripts from Dunhuang. So because this audience has not had that introduction, I want to give a short introduction to what are the Dunhuang manuscripts, why are they important, how did they come to be, and what we can use them for in the study of Buddhism. Then I'm really going to hit the heart of my talk today in sections 4 and 5, when I run through 2 different liturgies, one based on the more straightforward transfer of merit, and I call it curing with karma. The second form is under number 5, and that is a variation on that karmic transfer of good karma, because it also involves the practice of confession on the part of the practitioner. I'll draw some conclusions about the combination, about how the materials I'm looking at in this whole cycle of lectures are a combination or a synthesis. On the one hand, they inherit Buddhist models, the Buddhist structure of Buddhist ritual that begins in India, but that travels across all of Asia with adaptations. The particular Chinese adaptation is to use Chinese literary forms, and of course the Chinese language, obviously, but also Chinese linguistic registers and Chinese literary styles in order to revise and adapt a basic Buddhist ritual structure. I promised to review the process of making merit. If you were at my first lecture, you'll recognize this diagram, which attempts to show the various participants, animate and inanimate, people, sentient beings of all kinds, as well as objects and things like spiritual power involved in the process of creating merit. There is a donor, usually always a human, not always a living human. Donors can be deceased people. Their clothing after they pass away, or their material goods can be used to make merit on their behalf. And they are counted as the donor for rituals on their behalf. Normally, and in the case we're looking at, rituals for curing, the donor is living and the beneficiary is also living, sick, and hence that's the pretext for the ritual. Gifts are given, and gifts range. I surveyed on my previous lecture the variety of gifts from humble to grandiose. The humblest being articles of clothing, used clothing, either silk or cotton or hemp, are perfectly acceptable as gifts for making merit, and gifts being given to the Sangha or gifts being given to sponsor a ritual. As far as use goes, many rituals, many gifts to the Sangha specify precisely what kind of ritual is supposed to be performed. Is it a memorial ritual? Is it a ritual for healing? Is it a ritual that is supposed to make merit in general for a lay society, a lay congregation, and so on? Beneficiaries, as I've already hinted, can be human or non-human. They can be alive or dead. They can be collective bodies, such as the nation or the community, in the case of a healing ritual for healing an epidemic. That is a sickness shared shared broadly within a community. So beneficiaries can range widely at its ultimate extent, and we'll be looking at this in my final lecture. The process of healing is extended to all sentient beings. And then the boon, what is the goodness? What is the well-being that is sought in the ritual? Often there is a spiral effect for boons being sought. That is, one is first healed. That's the first wish, that the patient be healed. But a second and third wish are usually included in many Buddhist liturgies. Typically, in the second wish, one asks for the healing or the enlightenment of the donor's entire family, covering many generations. And in the third wish, the benefits, the boons, are extended to either all sentient beings or perhaps all the spirits, all the guardian spirits, seen and unseen, from the highest heavens to the lowest reaches. So that's the process of making merit. Let me turn now and introduce the Dunhuang manuscripts, because I'm going to be drawing from them, especially today, in today's lecture. And I don't want to assume that everyone knows all about the Dunhuang materials. First of all, let's talk about their content. The Dunhuang manuscripts consist of about 60,000 pieces. And the pieces can range from small to large. So what is a manuscript? It depends. If a single sheet of if a single sheet of a piece of paper from a scroll has become detached, or if a single sheet of paper was preserved from its creation until now, that is one manuscript. But also, if 10 sheets of paper are pasted together, one after the other, to form a scroll, that entire scroll counts as a single manuscript. So the actual number of manuscripts is a little misleading, because it actually includes not apples and oranges per se, but it includes pieces of apples and very large apples in the same count. So, but nevertheless, it's what we use. We have to count them, and libraries count them, and caretakers count the numbers of manuscripts. So, roughly 60,000 manuscripts survive from the Dunhuang cache. Of those 60,000 manuscripts, about 2,000 contain one or more liturgies. It's further complicated by the fact that many manuscripts, the physical object, pieces of paper that, as in book form or sheet form, contained more than one text. I can put the Diamond Sutra in the first half of a booklet, and I can put the scripture on the 10 Kings in the second half of the booklet, and it becomes part of a chanting program for monks at monasteries. That's 2 texts on 1 manuscript. That tends to be the rule rather than the exception for many manuscripts. So of the 60,000, roughly 2,000 of them contain 1 or more liturgies. These are rituals for the production and transfer of merit. The majority, almost 50% of the rituals for producing merit that survive from Dunhuang, their main purpose is to give sustenance and aid to the deceased. I consider those memorial rituals, funerary rituals. They're very important. They're very interesting. Their scenarios for rebirth and the afterlife are just very exciting and interesting to deal with. I'm looking at the second most popular, or the second most numerous form or manuscripts, and those are transfer of merit rituals in which the beneficiary is a sick person, and the boon that is prayed for is the person's healing. And they're about, as you can see, there are about 125 manuscripts, individual pieces or individual books that contain healing liturgies. They were produced from the 7th to the 10th century. I've given there in Chinese the terminology used in Chinese for these two, the broader genre of liturgical text or a ritual text or literally a Jai one. Jai is, in this case, Jai means many things, but in this case it means a feast or a ritual sponsored by anyone. So it's a text for a feast or a ritual. English, it's just easier to say a liturgy in the commonly accepted sense of that term as a written text or procedure for the performance of a ritual. They were compiled from the 7th to the 10th century, from roughly the year 600 through the year 1000. The subgenre or the more specific genre that I'm looking at is called Huanwen. Huan, of course, also means many things, but can mean difficulty and can mean a problem. In this case, it's essentially a euphemism for sickness in particular. They include both individual pieces as well as anthologies of texts. So that's the overall numbers. Let's look at one of the most common anthologies of liturgical text, of ritual text from Dunhuang. It contains a total of 7 chapters. So I'm not going to run through the individual items in these in the 7 chapters, but I do want to give you some idea of what the broader repertoire consisted of. So that's why this slide is there. This anthology is entitled Various Liturgical Texts, 杂斋文, in 1 volume. It survives in about 25 different examples. It's 25 different manuscripts from Dunhuang, and my colleagues Wang Sanqing in Taiwan and Huang Zhang and Wu Wei in China on the mainland have done excellent editions of this text, the original text in Chinese, comparing all of the variants and making very good sense of them, providing a very workable and accurate base text. Chapter 1. These are the chapter titles given by the users, the compilers of the text. So the compilers organized the text. They didn't just throw a bunch of liturgies together one after the other. They organized them, they grouped them together, and they numbered them. The first chapter consists basically of really big projects, not small projects. They consist of constructing buildings like Buddha halls, making statues, commissioning a lot of scriptures, or making banners. The second chapter basically covers smaller acts of merit making, lots of standard lay Buddhist activities that any small to any lower class to middle class person could engage in. These, as you can see, include things like prayers, feasts, holding feasts. Liturgy for reading at the four gates involves a procession of statues around the city, and so forth. The third chapter is liturgies for averting disaster. This is something of a misnomer, or it's the opposite of a euphemism. These are actually very happy occasions of installing a parasol to protect a statue. Or Arya Ba'ir, this is in medieval China, this was the 8th day of the second lunar month. It was considered the day of the Buddha's departure and enlightenment. That is when he leaves the palace, and also on it's compressed time. He is believed to have left the palace and achieved enlightenment on the same day. Chapter 4 is where the liturgies I'm going to be reading today, interpreting today, come from. They're liturgies for sickness. I note, look at the titles of both 13 and 14. Childbirth is considered a form of a threat to one's health, for which extra help is needed. So it's put under the category of sickness. Chapter 5. This is by far the most important, most frequently used liturgies were liturgies for the deceased, Wang Wan. There are four chapters here, 15, 16, 17, 18. You see they tend to be named for the specific social status. So we write one kind of liturgy for a deceased monk, we write another kind of liturgy for a deceased nun. They're structurally similar, but the words we say about praising the beneficiary are different in each case, and it tends to go by social status. So we have monks distinguished from nuns, we have parents, we have mothers, we have sons and daughters. We have the liturgy at graveside is different than the liturgy performed at home or in a temple for a memorial feast, and so forth. Chapter 6 are essentially social subordinates. All kinds of rituals can be conducted here. A servant, a maid, a horse, an ox, domestic animals. Sons departing for battle, sons or husbands departing for battle. And then 7th chapter is the really big one, and that is the local celebration at Buddhist temples in honor of the emperor. So the conclusion I draw from this are a couple. The users of these manuscripts were the monks who performed the rituals often. And certainly this particular text was compiled as an anthology so that ritualists could use it, could draw from it when they needed to perform any of these 38 different forms of ritual. Furthermore, the monks who put this together understood what they were putting together as a genre. They gave it a title. They didn't just throw together liturgies on different sheets of paper. They gave a title to the text, and the different texts and the many copies we have correspond with one another. So they understand that this is a genre with subgenres within it, and they spent a fair amount of time arranging them pieces logically, putting them in order, distinguishing them from each other, grouping them together. So that's a fair amount on content. I want to look briefly at the formats, and I do so because it's important in general, but it's also important for a specific reason. By looking at the format, the way the text is bound and produced, and we gain a lot of insight into how specific manuscripts were actually used in performance of rituals or not in performance of rituals. Perhaps they were used for reference by a monk who was composing liturgies or drafting liturgies, or perhaps they had some other use. So I'm going to show you the three major formats in which liturgical manuscripts occur at Dunhuang. What you see here is a booklet or a codex. Consists of pieces of paper. Sometimes, I'm not going to tear up my notes, but sometimes it's a sheet of paper this size and then another sheet of paper this size that are simply pasted together at the edge, at the margin, and then so they're similar to a very cheaply bound paperback book nowadays. Individual sheets of paper that are stuck together against a piece of binding glue at the edge against a binding. That's the most common method. It's the easiest. It's the cheapest. It's a little more complex to take a piece of paper literally and fold it in half, and get another piece of paper and fold it in half, and essentially make traditional signatures of a book. But there were codices made in both methods and more at medieval Dunhuang. It's about this size. So this is a very handy size for carrying around. The pages are easier to flip. It's easier to flip the pages than it is to unroll the scroll, because you need a flat surface to unroll a scroll. So these were typically used in chanting in ritual situations. This one comes with titles, Huanwen Di Si, so the fourth chapter on healing rituals. That's why I chose this one to show. And then we have the first line of the text, Jie Yi, Jue Ti, Qian Rong, Jue Bai Fei Yu Shi Xiang, and so on. The text is written in black ink, but there's also red marks, as you see. These is punctuation. These are stops put in by the user, by the monk who was chanting. And the reason is most texts, even texts for practical use, were not punctuated when they were first written out. So this was not punctuated in black by the person who copied the manuscript. It was punctuated in red at a later point. And figuring out where the stops are is crucial because of the meter and the rhythm and the sound, to say nothing of the sense. But it's crucial for all those reasons. So the monk who used this text added the red punctuation to make sure that he hit the right stops at the end of sentences, and that he understood where each couplet was. And then he also added some aesthetic markings. There's a flame here. There's a flame above each of the chapter headings, flame or candle. And then there are also brackets, rubrication marks in red that divide sections or titles. So that's a codex format or a booklet format. There is also the earlier format, and certainly the most common in the medieval period, was a scroll. And a scroll is made of pieces of paper that are pasted together one after another and then rolled up. This particular manuscript, I think it's about 15. I looked at the first 2 pages, sheets of paper this morning. I didn't look at all of them, so I think it's about 15 sheets long. And this is the first sheet of paper. And so this is the beginning. As you can see, it's ripped at the beginning. This material, this light color without any text on it is backing added by the conservators at the British Library. So the original is ripped, as you can see at the beginning, as are many of the manuscripts at Dunhuang. And it has 3 lines of text, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 ends here. This is actually the end of a liturgy for childbirth. And then begins, being E, then begins a section on of a healing ritual, the intention or the idea of curing. It's not a full curing ritual, it's just a section of it. So this is very much a piece of, this is a scroll that contains modules, pieces of liturgies that can be substituted in and out when compiling a fuller liturgy. It has the title here, it has another title here for curing or getting better, and then it stops giving titles after that. So it's a scroll with many modules on it. It has these marks, yun yun, basically means and so on. That is, you get to the end of this section, and then shama shama gong de, and then and so forth. Meaning, then you continue with another section, and those marks recur. So, and then there are also fairly blotchy corrections, such as this, and they recur throughout the manuscript. So this was also used by a monk, but it was used not in a performance, but it was rather used more for consultation, for consideration when composing, either in his head or on another piece of paper, an actual ritual text that would be used in a specific ritual. One more format I want to introduce. And in some ways, it makes most sense that it was the most common. So what we're looking at is Stein manuscript number 4537. We're looking at the end of the second sheet of it from here to here. And then you see this is the end of the second sheet. And then it's pasted to a third sheet here. And then the third sheet continues onward. These sheets were originally separate. The text from sheet number 2 to sheet number 3 is not continuous. The text on sheet 2 is complete. The text on sheet 3 is complete. So this was not intended to be a scroll when it was first produced. It was rather one liturgy per sheet. Each one of these was a liturgy for a specific person. And we know this because the person is named. Most of these are for the military governor of the Dunhuang area, or the entire, essentially the entire Heshi corridor. We'll look at a map in a minute to give you some idea. It's basically most of Gansu province would be included under the governor's purview. And they were, some of them are dated, and so we know that most of them date from sometime in the 950s, 950 AD. So 3 different formats, 3 different kinds of uses, right? A codex for use in chanting, in performance of the ritual, not in chanting, but for recitation during the performance of the ritual. A scroll, which was used for consulting when composing rituals, liturgical manuscripts, and actual sheets of paper that contain complete texts that I imagine, I can't prove it, but I imagine were taken, rolled up and held in the sleeve and taken out during the performance of specific rituals. So that's content. That's format. Let's turn now let me shift gears a little bit and provide a step way back and give a brief overview of where the manuscripts come from and what the significance of the Dunhuang materials are in general. So this is a heavily doctored, and therefore a very instructive map. Colors are important here. The brown and the white indicate lack of water or lower levels of water. The brown being dry desert, the tan being the lowest, the darker brown being mountains that are dry, and the white, of course, being the Tibetan plateau that is dry and very high, right? So because of the surrounding of the huge upswing of the Tibetan plateau and the consequent formation of mountain ranges around here, this and the dryness of the Taklamakan Desert in between them, the very dry and very low Taklamakan Desert. What this means is that if anything is going to travel from east to west across the eastern half of the Eurasian continent, it can't go across the Taklamakan Desert, and it's hard to get from north to south. Individuals do it, but it's hard to do. And so the most logical, the most convenient ways for things to travel are east-west and skirting the edges of the Taklamakan Desert and staying not highest in the mountains and also not in the very lowest spots. Of course, there are cities in the desert. They are fed by underwater rivers that pop up nearer to the surface in the oasis towns of the desert. The other thing I want to point out about this map is that it is deceptive in suggesting that well, there was one highway from central China and one highway from the northern plains and one highway going due west, and then the road split. You could take a northern route, you could take a southern route, you could take a quick route, and then the highways rejoined, and then you kept going on this road here. That didn't happen, right? There were many Silk Roads. The transmission of all things took place at much smaller lengths. That is, very few people, except for Xuanzang and Marco Polo, went the entire length from one end to the other. Transmission of most things, including material goods, the 7 jewels, the famous 7 jewels, material goods, silk, paper, ideas, monks, statues, merchants. Most transmissions were short range, and they were handing off goods to the next dealer to the next merchant or caravan along the path. So we really need to rethink how we talk about the Silk Road. This is something that people in Silk Road studies have done recently that I find very helpful, is to talk about Silk Roads in the plural. And of course, it's not just silk being transmitted. In some ways, paper have been even more fundamental as a means of transmission. And there are many, many different routes of transmission. But this is important to look at because it explains the elevation and the geography are important because it explains the significance of Dunhuang in the next map. Where's Dunhuang? Dunhuang is in this circle here. It's the town, this very small yellow circle, and the Mogao Caves, where the manuscripts were discovered 15 miles away, is this small yellow square. Here's the image is the road. This actually follows the Heshi corridor here through Gansu. This is Lanzhou, the ancient in former times called Wuwei. This is the Heshi corridor. Those of you who've been to Dunhuang, if you didn't fly in, if you took the train or if you drove, you followed the Heshi corridor because it's the only, you're right up against the edge of the mountains and yet you're not in the desert. It's the way to go. It's the way armies went in the past. It's the way that the Han expedition in the Han Dynasty went, sent by the Han Wudi, the Emperor Wu of the Han. It's the way that the Tang armies went when they went out to reestablish control over essentially Xinjiang, what's now Xinjiang. They followed the same path. And the significance of Dunhuang is that Dunhuang essentially is the fork in the road. And so if you're moving from east to west, you have to pass through Dunhuang, and then you can either go north or south. And that's just a fact of geography. So Dunhuang was established very early on as an outpost of the imperial Chinese government, even in the Han Dynasty, and it continued to play that role. Similarly, if you're a trader coming north out of India and making your way through these very difficult mountains, you'll either come this way or this way, and again you'll pass through Dunhuang if you're moving east. Let's say you're a Tibetan pilgrim and you want to go to Mount Wutai, you would basically go this way. So Dunhuang is a fork in the road. It's also helpful to think of Dunhuang as in the medieval period as a port city. It's an inland port. Why? Because goods are shipped there and then they leave there and go out. And the port city is large. It's got a significant garrison, army stationed there, and lo and behold, it also held a surprisingly large number of monasteries during most of the Buddhist monasteries during most of the medieval period. So the other thing this map emphasizes, I've drawn. This is it's a wonderful map. It's part of the supplied by the International Dunhuang Project, and unfortunately, in the modern age, well, let me start at the beginning. Fortunately, through the good work of Susan Whitfield, trained as a historian of Tang history, in late 90s, Susan put together funding for the International Dunhuang Project, IDP, to collect online and to reassemble online all of the manuscripts and artifacts that had originally been at Dunhuang and were later dispersed. I'll get to that story in a couple more slides. The IDP website was hacked in November. It was actually more than hacked. It was ransomed. And it will soon be back online, but it's not back online yet. So if you go to the IDP website, you won't find anything there right now. Their Twitter account is okay, but their website is not. So this map provided by IDP is helpful. What I've done in particular is to add these red circles in order to accentuate the mix of polities and cultures and languages that were part of the Silk Road commerce. And it's one of the things that makes Dunhuang so interesting, is that it's not simply an outpost of China. It's also next to and houses many people from the Turkic and Uyghur empires to the north and east. This map, the IDP does not date it, but it's got to be from the second half of the Tang Dynasty. The reason is that the Tibetan Empire is the same size as the Chinese Empire. And that was true for 80 years, from roughly just after the Anlushan Rebellion, which really decimated the Tang Dynasty, and the Tang Dynasty shrank in half And immediately, Tibetan armies took advantage of the weakened Chinese military situation and expanded out of Lhasa and really covered what had been under nominal Tang control for the entire western half of what had been Tang territory. So that's when this map dates from, but it's instructive because it shows, yes, Tibetan Empire is a significant player at this point in history. Khotan here is a small empire of a couple city-states, relatively small but very important for linguistically and for other reasons, culturally. And then, of course, all the way west, there's the Arab Caliphate and of course, various early European civilizations and polities. What this shows, let me just summarize, is the importance of the different polities, the different cultures, the different nationalities, probably too strong a word for it, but ethnicities and cultures as marked by very different language families at the time. Okay, let me move into more modern history, just review briefly the history of discovery at Dunhuang. This is a highly romanticized photo, nicely provided by the Dunhuang Yanzhou Yuan, the Dunhuang Academy. It shows the cliff face of very soft rock. It's not hard rock, it's very soft, it's covered by sand. This is a river in front of it. That's what's responsible for carving out the cliff. The southern section, roughly 2/3 of a mile of almost 500 caves, which were excavated and turned into temples from roughly the 300s through the year 1200. And then the northern section, which also contains caves hollowed into the soft rock, but which are not decorated nearly as much. So most of them are not full-fledged temples in any sense. Where were the manuscripts discovered? The manuscripts were discovered in the Cave 17. This is the numbering system we now use, that the Dunhuang Academy has helped us with. Cave 17 is a small cave. I'll show you how small in a minute. It's a small cave and it's a side chamber. It was not originally set up as a large cave temple. As you can see, it was essentially a side storage room. What was the main cave? The main cave was Cave 16. This is the cliff face here, extends down here. Sticking out from the cliff face, so as you're facing the caves, when you're facing the caves, originally it wouldn't look like this. What you would see if in the 7th through the 11th centuries, you would have not looked into each cave opening as you do in this illustration. You would be looking at front rooms, antechambers. You would be looking at wooden temples affixed in front of the cave, in front of the cliff face, a whole series of them with stairs. That was in fact the construction of Cave 16, as it was of many caves at Dunhuang. Almost all of those wooden structures fell away a long time ago, hundreds of years ago. We know about them because the foundations for the pillars had been excavated, and there have been just tremendous archaeological work done on that. Some of it quite relatively early in the 50s and 60s, and more of it recently. So originally there were stairs that led up to an antechamber, probably decorated with the 4 guardian kings. Whenever you enter most Buddhist temples, you enter through Sutianwang or the Devarajas, or the protectors, or the local deities protecting the space. Then you enter a corridor in the cliff face, in the cliff itself, and then you enter a main chamber. Then the main chamber is carved out, and an altar is put there with a main Buddha statue and attendants. And that's one of the standard methods of constructing cave temples. As you can see, there's in the vertical elevation, the wooden chamber, the wooden antechamber had a real roof. It had a real ceiling with timber and frame and construction, befitting the same as a wooden temple, the most common form of temple at the time, Buddhist temple at the time. And the main chamber had was carved into the rock, and so was carved upward in this shape. We call it, our historians call it the inverted bushel. It's a basket put upside down, a bushel basket put upside down, and which is a way to use the earth to replicate the look of a specific kind of well of heaven, a specific kind of receding roof in the temple above. All of this is to say is Cave 16 is a serious composition. It's a serious construction. It's large. It has two main rooms, two main chambers connected by a corridor. It was well thought out. It had paintings on all the walls. I'll show you in a minute. Cave 17 has none of that. Cave 17 was different. Cave 17 is where the manuscripts were discovered. Okay, let's look at what Cave 17 looked like originally. This is what it looked like originally. The dimensions of it are about 9 by 9 feet square, and about 6 feet tall. The ceiling is about 6 feet. This is, and there was a pedestal with this statue, which is of a 8th or 9th century monk, Hongbian. Very important monk from a very important family. It was a mixed family, that is Tibeto-Chinese family. It was a cave that memorialized his deeds and memorialized him. So it was to make merit for him, but it was also to honor him. How do we know this? There's a stele there. There is an inscription, his memorial inscription, erected by his family, which gives it follows a standard writing style of Chinese biographical, Chinese biography that praises him and runs through his career. Not his career as an official, but his career as a Buddhist monk. And then there is there one wall of the temple is painted. It's kind of painted with two trees and a monk's satchel hanging from this tree right here. It's clearly there to show him in some realistic relationship. He was a monk. He would have had a satchel. He would have been honored by the lay members of his family. At some point, after this was used as a memorial cave for this monk, the statue was taken out and it was filled from floor to ceiling and wall to wall with 60,000 manuscripts and paintings. This is kind of what it looked like. With those manuscripts in it. I say kinda because this photo was taken in 1908, which was 8 years after the cave was opened, discovered really. Most of them, these scrolls had already been taken out of the cave and then put back in by successive waves of quote-unquote explorers, shall we call them. And as you can see, most of the materials, well, not all the materials, these materials look like mostly scrolls, and they're wrapped in wrappers. They're literally called wrappers. Most of them are made of cloth, most of them are made of hemp. And then looks like there's some flatter codexes, booklets here, probably Tibetan manuscripts, actually, which were almost exclusively produced in a poti format. So that's what it looked like, kind of, to get some idea of what it would have looked like when it was filled up. Let's go back. This is the main chamber. Here, this is the corridor. This space from here to here originally was plastered over. Cave 17 is behind this door. But the door is modern. The door wasn't there when the cave was sealed up in 11th century. The entire wall was plastered over from here to here, and the paintings that you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there were probably 7 of these deities, and they continued here. That's the relation of Cave 16 to 17. Cave 17 really was a side room, as I said, originally used as a memorial cave, later decommissioned. The statue, the monk who's being honored, was taken out and moved to another cave, the one above it, actually. And then it was filled with 60,000 mostly manuscripts on paper, but also some manuscripts on silk, and also about 200 paintings on silk, but also scraps of paper and writing desks and styluses and some brushes and some other things. This is the discoverer of the cave, Wang Yuanlu, who did not have an easy life, serving in the Qing army in the late 1890s. When he finished serving for the imperial forces, I think he's from the Gansu area. He went to Dunhuang and was the self-appointed caretaker at the caves. They were very much in disuse. They were not an active religious site. They hadn't been for hundreds of years. They were filled with sand. Just to get into the caves, you had to shovel sand out to get in. This photo is taken. So Wang Yuanlu discovered the manuscripts in the year 1900. It's a lovely story. He tells. Who knows if it's true, but he tells it, and it's become an accepted part of Dunhuang lore. He was walking through the corridor of Cave 16 one day. Remember right here. So he was walking in the corridor, and his lamp was blown out, and the wind was coming from here somewhere. So he goes to the wall and he sees a pinhole or some kind of, like, maybe a hole the size of a finger width, and wind's coming through it. So he opens it further. He pulls at the straw on the plaster that had been used to cover it, and lo and behold, he discovers this side chamber with all these manuscripts in it. So that is Wang Yuanlu's discovery in the year 1900. Meanwhile, all the great Western and Eastern powers, so the Western powers and Japan, are racing all over Central Asia and parts of East Asia, but especially Central Asia, and for political reasons, and they also, the same polities send their geographers and their cultural attachés. And so that's why Stein, Aurel Stein, so his name was Marcus Aurelius Stein, Mark Aurel Stein, Hungarian, Indologist by training, working for Her Majesty's government, that is the British government. in their colonial rule in India. He was a tremendous geographer, a tremendous explorer. He cast himself in the guise of Xuanzang and Marco Polo. We know this because that's how he cast himself in some of his later writing. He had been first in India and then in Central Asia doing geological and geographical, topographic, and archaeological expeditions. He gets to Dunhuang in the year 1907 and convinces Wang Yuanlu to give up, quote unquote, sell him, although they weren't Wang's to sell and they weren't really Stein's to buy, a batch of manuscripts. That's 1907. Stein doesn't write about it much until 1921. That's the full report, when the full report comes in. But it's clear already in 1907 there's a race on to find antiquities in Central Asia and Tibet and bring them home to wherever. So first Stein, then the scholar Paul Pelliot, whom we see kneeling in the caves here. He spent 3 weeks, almost night and day, sorting through manuscripts in the cave. First Stein, then Pelliot. So Stein's materials went to the British Library and the British Museum. Pelliot's materials went to the Musée Guimet and the Bibliothèque Nationale. The 2 Russian teams came later. 3 different Japanese teams came. And then, so if you read Dunhuang manuscripts now, where do you go? You go to the 4 major collections, and they are in London, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, and then the significant about 15,000 out of those 60,000 manuscripts are in China. There was a significant batch left in the caves, left in China, which the Qing government and then the early, the very ending, the final years of the Qing dynasty, the Ministry of Education did send a team to recuperate what was left and bring it back to Beijing. Okay, I'm gonna change subjects, and I'm gonna jump right into, or I'm gonna jump back into Buddhist ritual. The significance of the Dunhuang materials and the reason that I spent some time trying to place them in time and space, but also as to why those materials, how those materials got there. The materials that were put in the cave were not a library. The materials that were put in the cave were written by hundreds of people, thousands of people, over a 600-year period from 400 to the year 1000. They come from people in all walks of life. Many of them are scrap pieces of paper. They're multiple copies of sutras that are torn, and nobody wanted to throw them out. They were just kept. Nobody wanted to do away with, nobody wanted to burn paper, nobody wanted to bury it. Instead, they kept it. So it's a tremendously rich and varied and unplanned archive that happens to survive. And we're fortunate that it preserves the liturgical manuscripts that somewhere between 50 to 100 different monks over several centuries at Dunhuang used for performing rituals. So let's look at the rituals. Before I get into the details, let me give an overview. the Indian Buddhist model, or one of the Indian Buddhist models for making merit, was well established at least by the 3rd century. It had 7 or 10 basic steps, and it traveled. It spread throughout other parts of Asia. It spread through the Buddhist cultures of South Asia, so we know it in Sri Lanka and throughout the Indian subcontinent. We know it in the Himalayas. We know it in the Tibetosphere. I use that term as a way of saying all those areas that use Tibetan language or translations from Tibetan. We know it in the Sinosphere, all those East Asia, all the cultural areas, essentially China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, which also uses Hansa, which also uses Chinese characters. And we also see it in Southeast Asia. That Indian model was adapted in China. In China, the versions, some versions have the same 7 steps, some have 4, some have 5. This development start around the 6th century. We see it in a variety of settings, the settings of Chinese Buddhism. We see it in Tiantai and Pure Land and esoteric school rituals. We also see it in Buddha Nama Sutras, Fa Ming Jing, and we see it in the materials I'm going to show you, which are the Dunhuang liturgies. What are the 7 steps on the Indian side? I'm not going to go through the details of all 7, but they begin with worshiping the Buddha, and then an offering is made, and then a ritual or a formulaic confession of faults. I'm going to skip the next 2, 4 and 5. And then one utters vows or prayers, and then one transfers merit. That's the basic Indian model. The typical name for it is the Anuttara Puja, but it also goes by the Shaptanga Puja, the offering in 7 parts. This is the Sanskrit. What are some of the Chinese adaptations of it? In the Dunhuang collected liturgies that I'm going to now read some examples from, some parts are maintained pretty directly, and some parts are either left out or substituted. So the changes here are in red. So the changes that are engineered in the Chinese versions, they do include something for worshiping or praising the Buddha, but they add a section where one declares the purpose of the ritual, and they add a section praising the patient in the case of a healing liturgy. There is something involving ritual actions. There's as you'll see in a few minutes, there's a variation where one does confession of faults. Sections 5 and 6 are reversed from the Indian original, as you can see, reverse the order. And then there's a closing that's added, something like a benediction in the Chinese case. So the basic structure is maintained, the basic Indian structure of the Indian Buddhist structure of the ritual is basically maintained, but some sections are added, some sections are subtracted, and two sections are reordered. And with that, I want to start reading some of the text. Now that we have a general idea of the structure of merit-making liturgies, I'd like to take you in more detail through each of the 7 steps. My goal is to explain both the general format of the ritual, which as I said, derives from pan-Buddhist ideas, as well as the language and phrasing of the text, which grew out of Chinese linguistic models and literary styles. I'm going to read through my translation and provide interpretation of one exemplary liturgy for healing illness. This is from Stein 1441. It's the verso side, and it's the 3D. It's the 3rd chapter, the 4th section. In other work, I have called this ritual text the most popular healing liturgy in medieval Dunhuang. It survives in 12 different manuscripts, 4 of them presenting the whole rite from beginning to end. The manuscripts, the 12 manuscripts, were produced over a pretty long length of time, from the year 600 to the year 1000. So not only was the liturgy written out many times by the monks who performed the rituals, it also endured for at least 400 years. The first section, so the section titles are mine, both the English and the Chinese. The original does not have these section titles. That is everything that's in a Roman numeral, as you see here for Qie. As you see here for Tanda, praising Buddha's virtue. That does not occur in the original. That's my addition to make sense of it. The first section of the liturgy provides a grand preface to the entire ritual by singing the praises of the Buddha. It uses abstract language drawn from both Buddhism and indigenous Chinese tradition. It sets a serious tone by using the lofty language of parallel prose. And I do have one slide on parallel prose before I end tonight. The first 2 sentences begin abstractly. I'm going to read them. I say, the substance of awakening hides and emerges, cutting off 100 forms of negation with the marks of truth. The Dharma body is profound and clear, perfecting 10,000 virtues in his true countenance. The next 2 sentences refer to the physical features of the Buddha's body, his golden-colored skin and his ornakesha, his white or yellow hair protruding from between his eyes, his eyebrows. Thus, the golden hue envelops all, covering the suns and moons of the great thousand world. The jade wisp of hair casts its hues, brightening the Qian and Kun of 10 billion universes. After this, the praise section brings the Buddha down to earth, narrating his salvific activity on behalf of suffering humanity. The liturgy refers to the way the Buddha succumbed to illness himself and enacted his own death, lying between the shala trees. It also makes the Buddha responsible for the teaching of Vimalakirti, who famously displayed the signs of sickness as an expedient device and magically enlarged his humble dwelling to cosmic proportions in order to accommodate a host of visitors. Sections C and D read, nevertheless, solely rescued from the cage of afflictions, he still manifested illness between the twin trees, alone transcending the bonds of dust. Nevertheless, he explained the sickness of Vimalakirti's one jhang room. He keeps afloat the illusory shadows in the city of Gandharvas, and he preserves the perilous forms in the rotting residence of samsara. Up to this point, the liturgies made no direct reference to the ritual at hand, other than the oblique references to Buddha's abilities and Vimalakirti's illness. The words spoken could serve as a sermon introducing really any Buddhist ritual. The second section of the liturgy, however, turns attention directly to the actors in the ritual and their reasons for performing it. Some liturgists, in fact, title this section the purpose of the ritual. So I did make up the section, I inserted them in my translation and in the Chinese text, but they do occur in a couple texts. So some liturgists use these words, jai, or the purpose of the rite. This section identifies the sponsors of the rite, the beneficiary, and what the rite is supposed to achieve. And this is quite different from the first section, which is about the Buddha. Now this is about the ritual. It reads, purpose, and now the purpose of the chanting by the donor seated in front is the donation offered on behalf of the infectious illness of such and such a person. Notice, our liturgy uses the word such and such a person, moren, an expression frequently used in Dunhuang liturgies. Such liturgical handbooks are collections of pieces that could be read aloud on different occasions and used for different individual sponsors. So when conducting the rite, the performer would fill in the words with the name of the sick person. The intention thus announced, In its third section, the liturgy turns to the patient, reverting to polished parallel prose. Sometimes this section offers both praise and blame. Praise is first touting the patient's virtues, and the blame is noting what evil deeds the person must have committed to cause the illness. In any event, the section always refers to the patient's sickness. The text reads, "Ah, the sick one. Now, after his cold and heat lack timeliness, and his nourishment goes against the standard, his 5 faculties are diseased by outflows, his 6 cavities full of afflictions. His strength is waning in movement and rest, fearing the 2 rats gnawing away the vine. His mood is disturbed day and night, afraid of the 4 snakes destroying the basket." You know, when I first started reading liturgies for healing, I thought that this way of describing the illness and discomfort of the patient was kind of vague. Almost any illness could fit this description. But after reading more primary sources and ethnographies of traditional Chinese medicine, I think that the wording follows hallowed medical practice in China. Traditional medical diagnosis always took account of the patient's emotional as well as their physical condition. The liturgy stresses the patient's anxiety and uncertainty. It's what we might now call mood disorders, but they count as an illness. The text involves well-known parables, including one that compares the ills of human existence to a man in a well, clutching onto a vine, which rats are about to chew through. So long parable, well-known parable in the medieval period. The fourth section, sometimes called the ritual area or ritual actions, refers to the actions performed by sponsors and officiants. Sometimes the actions are very concrete, including the burning of incense, decoration of statues, and offering of money and cloth. Other times, the liturgy speaks more abstractly, evoking the audience's reverence toward the 3 jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read the 4th section tonight. I can get to the 5th section instead. This, I think, is the most critical part of the whole procedure. In the logic of Buddhist ritual, making an offering constitutes a deed, and all deeds have consequences. But remember that in Buddhism, the deeds don't necessarily attach to the original actor. Instead, he or she can offer the results of their deeds to other people. Dedicating good results to others is precisely what this section of the liturgy accomplishes. I consider this brief section to be the hinge of the entire ritual. Without saying these words and accomplishing the transfer, the good results will go, in effect, unclaimed. It's a short section, fairly complicated in its formulation and its sentence structure. It reads, "We take this merit and the fortunate causes from the chanting and use them first to ornament the sick one himself." That's a fairly literal translation. We could make it the English much better than this if we wanted to aim for fluency, I think. The word ornament, the Chinese here is zhuangyan, carries a lot of significance. Our colleagues in Indian studies know this word in its Sanskrit guises, especially the fundamental concept of aesthetics as well as poetic composition, alamkara. The language only appears to be frivolous or concerned with outward facade. It doesn't mean excess. Rather, it involves the noble character of a deity, a realm, or a person. In our liturgy, the act of ornamenting a sick person is not simply altering their external appearance or the physical symptoms. Rather, it involves an elevation or a change in their character. Some rites in exactly this 5th section speak more plainly, and they substitute other simpler, I think, cruder words for the term or ornamentation. They use words like transfer or carry over. Other liturgies refer directly to the act of assisting the patient. The merit is mobilized to offer assistance to 奉咨, or to provide help to 咨询, the sick person. To continue with the performance of the healing rite, the sixth section of the liturgy explains precisely how the merit should benefit the patient. We want to benefit the patient, we want to cure him. How is that going to be done? The transfer of merit we just examined in section 5 is pretty much the same no matter what benefit is sought in ritual. The same wording of ornamentation, we take the merit produced and transfer it or use it to ornament the beneficiary. That stays the same whether you're building a temple, commissioning a statue, healing a sick family member, or seeking a better afterlife. But the sixth section of the rite varies according to the benefits being sought. So the boons in a healing ritual are cast in the form of prayer, a wish or a vow, which reads as follows. We pray that, or I pray that, let us pray that. The 404 illnesses dissipate like clouds because of this. The 5 coverings and 10 bonds be extinguished on account of this. Medicine King and Supreme Medicine by Raja and by Samudgata confer magical prescriptions. Sound Observer and Wondrous Sound, or Avalokiteshvara and Dasvara, bestow their wondrous medicine. That sickness of the body and sickness of the mind on this day be eliminated, calm when sleeping and calm when awake, his rising and resting be light and easy. May all his enemies, that is all directly about the sick person, the patient. Next, return to others. May all his enemies and creditors, anyone to whom he owes money or life, share a portion of his merit and cease being adversaries and release the sickness that they have caused him to suffer and return him to his former condition. In my third lecture in this series, I will look in more detail at how liturgies imagine the healing to take place. This is one scenario, naming certain agents, both deities who would massage him and relieve him in certain ways, as well as adversaries who may have, in this life or another life, whom he may have wronged and who are now taking their retribution by causing him illness. I will go into that in more detail. Suffice it to say that this section of the rite portrays curing not as a single event. It's not take the medicine and you're cured just like that. Rather, it's a process. Restoring good health clearly depends on the intervention of deities, right, and participation of other curative actors. It also requires the release of any debts and recrimination by one's enemies. Most liturgies seek a full quota of the proverbial 3 wishes. So we have had 1 wish and 1 ornamentation, 1 transfer, and now we're going to go to the second and third. After attending to the patient's health, our liturgy makes a second ornamentation, this one directed at the sponsor of the rite, along with a second prayer specifying how the benefits should be enjoyed. The third wish is stated more succinctly. The text reads, "We further take the superlative good to ornament the donor himself. We pray that 1,000 disasters be terminated forthwith and 10,000 fortunes arrive, old and young, fresh and easy, forever free of calamity." Next, in the third prayer, third wish, we pray that parents who have passed away will with their own eyes see the dragon flower tree. Those born through womb or egg or the 4 forms of birth will together achieve the fruit of Buddhahood. The liturgy ends with what I would call a benediction. It's 4 syllables in Sanskritized Chinese, followed by the equivalent of the word etc. So it goes Mahaprajna and so on. Other versions spell out what's there in the ellipsis, indicates to me that for the manuscript in question, the user, the reciter, the performer, was so well acquainted with the words that he just didn't need to include them. But as you can see, they read other versions when they do spell it out, Mahaprajna, profit and happiness without limit, the whole assembly sincere, all chanting together. Confession. I want to get to confession. Some of the healing liturgies embed another ritual structure within the sequence we just examined. Still based on the logic of karma, this second model for healing adds a confession to the proceedings. Not much is dropped from the basic structure of the basic healing liturgy. New elements are simply added. In terms of the structure of ritual, the differences from the standard format of curing with karma comes in two sections, which I show here in red. The first section invokes a wide range of supernatural beings, invites them to attend the ceremony. Deities are invited down from the heavens, and lesser spirits are asked to materialize themselves. The other different section is the fourth, which normally details the ritual actions that create merit. In confession rituals, the ritual actions here are the confession, the words spoken either by the sick person or for the sick person. In terms of roles, the new ritual substructure involves a confessor. It involves auditors, people or beings who hear the confession, listen to it, typically a body of monks, and venerable figures, usually deities, who authenticate the confession. We should remember in the background here that Chinese Buddhist monks and nuns from the earliest times until now have always understood the importance of ritualized confession to the practice of Buddhism. So members of the Sangha know this practice very well. It's only been over the past 20 years that secular scholars, such as myself, who haven't learned, don't perform the confession ritual as part of a monastic lifestyle, that secular scholars have begun to fully appreciate this. On a historical note, the widespread practice of confession grew out of the fortnightly confession and recitation of the Pratimoksha by monks and nuns, but it was highly developed beyond that as well in Chinese Buddhism. So the first section, I'm just going to read two sections of the confession, the two sections that are different in the confession ritual before I conclude. The first section of the confession rite invokes the deities who will verify the confession. I provide the relevant section from a healing liturgy, in this case for a monk. The deities invited to descend to the ritual arena include not only Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but also dragons, the four Mahadevaraja, and other gods. Our text reads, humbly we invoke, and then the list of deities reads as follows. Buddhas of the three bodies and four forms of knowledge, of the 5 kinds of eye and 6 penetration, Bodhisattvas of the 10 stages and 10 kinds of mind, as numerous as dust and sand, innumerable Shravakas, voice hearers, of the 4 routes and the 4 fruits, the 8 great classes of dragons and deities, Long Tian Babu, the assemblies of the 4 heavenly kings, and then finally spirits hidden in the darkness and manifest in space, those with the power of the path and the mind of stages. And the invocation continues. Humbly we pray that they emerge from concentration atop blossom platforms and descend to this Dharma gathering, that on this day, at this hour, they authenticate what we state. That is, authenticate the confession that's going to be stated. And now we extensively welcome the pure assembly and open the way for the true vehicle. There is a great congregation of black robes in line, that is the Sangha is lined up in order of seniority, and incense smoke wafts around the mats. Succeeding parts of the liturgy follow the next steps of the ritual, which you've already seen. The second section of the confession rite states the purpose of the ritual. It refers to the assembled Sangha serving as audience and so forth, and it names the performer and the beneficiary in an answer to a rhetorical question. The third section praises the patient, as we saw in the third section earlier. The last text I want to consider is the fourth section of the confession ritual. So the purpose and patient, the second and third sections continue as normal. The fourth section is adjusted for a confession ritual. As we've seen, most healing rites make reference to the actions of the main donor or performer. But when confession is used in a healing rite, the words spoken by the confessor are placed right here. This particular text, as I said, is intended for a monk, and so the misdeeds recited here are abrogations of the Vinaya. The section opens with a general introduction and admission of guilt, and then moves to specific transgressions. It's followed by the act of contrition and the request to be forgiven. It also includes a request that his enemies and creditors, including those from previous lives, share in the beneficial results of the confession and release him from the sickness they visited upon him. The text reads, as you see, the Vinaya Master himself says, I was born during the end of the Dharma, so only in appearance and name have I left the householder's life. In other words, I am not a good monk, because I live in the age of the decline of the Dharma, the Mo Fa, and I appear to be a monk, but I fall short. My practice of the precepts is always insufficient, so I often commit sins of neglect or transgression. For instance, in walking among viharas and stupas and sitting and sleeping on the fields of gold, the valuables belonging to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha I have coveted to no end. It continues. Such sins as these are immeasurable and without limit. Like the sand of the Ganges, it is hard to know their number. Now, before the pure assembly, I confess and ask forgiveness for my past mistakes. May all my creditors share in the merit. May they loosen their enmity and give up their bonds and give rise to pleasant thoughts. May they release the sickness and return me to my former condition. So this was a confession ritual explicitly for a monk who's supposed to be cured by it. But in the corpus of Dunhuang healing liturgies, there are separate confession rites not only for monks, but also for nuns, for regular lay people, and for lay people who are government officials. I'm not going to run through those, but I'm not going to run through all of those, but they're really interesting lists of what kinds of transgressions are attributed or have to be confessed formulaically by what kinds of people. The dossier of transgressions by nuns are particularly long and detailed. Perhaps that reflects the interests of the monks who composed the liturgies and officiated at the rites. For nuns, sins include accepting the donation of decorated or embroidered cloth rather than unadorned fabric, challenging their teachers or elders, slandering their sisters or pointing out their omissions, setting aside common property for personal use, and meting out heavier punishments than justice would demand. For government officials, there's also a lengthy list of sins. Not as many as for nuns, but a lot. The enumerated crimes for officials include brash and wasteful behavior, the intemperate taking of life, deceiving good people, arrogance and rude treatment of others, and exploiting one's position for personal gain. The particulars here in the confession section are different according to one's social class, one's gender, one's seniority, and one's status within the Buddhist fold. Nevertheless, such confessions always end with the admission of guilt, the claim that all sins have now been aired in front of the Sangha, that nothing is being concealed, and the hope that Buddhas respond favorably to the contrition just expressed. Furthermore, for all of their reliance on the ideology of karma and the public enactment of confession, the liturgies also emphasize the importance of sincerity and the pure intentions of the performer. So now I have my own confession to make to the worthies gathered here in the audience. And that is, I don't really have time to fully explain my final point, which is that the forms of healing ritual examined today, the curing with karma on the one hand and curing with confession on the other, are a synthesis. That's one of my broader claims. As I suggested at the start, merit-making liturgies in medieval China combined a widespread Buddhist ritual structure with a literary form taken from indigenous Chinese models. I've spent most of my time already with the structure, noting the sequence of actions and what's accomplished in each step. So let me just add a few comments about Chinese literary style, and perhaps we can pursue this further in the Q&A. Several sections of the liturgy employ the literary style known in Chinese as parallel prose. For those of you who aren't familiar with this form of classical Chinese, the basic unit of composition in parallel prose is the couplet, 2 lines. Couplets can exhibit numerous forms of parallelism. They can have the same meter, such as phrases composed of 4 characters plus 6 characters. They can use synonyms that match between the 2 lines. They can be grammatically parallel. They can employ comparable prosody or tonal patterns, or all of these. Furthermore, for much of the medieval period, parallel prose was the dominant style for the composition of what I would call high ritual in Chinese culture. The liturgies for memorializing the ancestors, lamenting a friend, greeting an important guest, prefacing a poetry collection, and so on. When I realized this some years ago, I had to go back to school, really, and rebuild my foundation in Chinese literature. So parallel prose is really important, but interestingly, not all sections of merit-making ritual employ parallel prose. That is, the different sections of merit-making liturgies alternate in their linguistic register. To put it bluntly, to the native ear, the different sections sound really different from each other when they're read aloud. Furthermore, I discovered that different linguistic registers are employed to achieve different ends in the ritual. Parallel prose is used to provide description, while the non-parallel prose section accomplishes performance rather than narration. So not only is there an audible distinction between the different sections of the rite, that linguistic differentiation corresponds to different goals of the section as well. Here, I've highlighted the sections of parallel prose in red, sections 1, 3, 4, 6, and 7. These sections describe the Buddha's virtue, they depict the patient's illness, they explain the rite, and they narrate the cure. These are all descriptive or narrative forms of discourse. Oops. This is missing some red here. I apologize. The red font should be used for number 2. It should be used for number 5, and it should be used for number 7. These sections of the ritual don't engage primarily in description. They rather step back from description and attempt to accomplish things. So section 2 announces the purpose of the ritual. Section 5, ornamentation, accomplishes the transfer of merit. And section 7 concludes the whole process. The linguistic variation was crafted by Chinese liturgists using indigenous models and varying the indigenous models as a way of accentuating the different sections of the ritual. It was a creative and attractive sounding way of adapting a Buddhist model for making merit and dedicating it to the benefit of others. I'm sure this opens more questions than answers, so I look forward to your comments and your criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Teiser. In fact, I think we should be the one who make the confession because we are not able to give you enough time to elaborate on the topic today. So we hope to learn more from you in the next lecture. And the section is now open to the floor. Please raise your hand if you have question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I'm the student from the MBS. So recently I've been reading about your book, The Ghost Festival in Medieval China. And in the chapter 8, you mentioned a really interesting topic, which is rather than sending gift directly to the ancestors, like people should like henceforth use a Senga as a medium. So maybe like a Senga is probably like the third party to transform this merit to ancestors. And of course, there is a very interesting like a ritual of merit and confession, which is we called the liberations, the rite of liberations of. I'm sorry, I forgot about like in English. It's actually 水陆法会. So it's also about like confession merit, and of course, the sun god in this ritual plays a really important role as well. So I was wondering, could you be more specific? Tell us like what the sun god is doing, kind of like a role in this transfer merit in the whole thing.
That's a really good question, really interesting. I've been discussing with Mr. Liao also the Shui Lu Fa Hui, the water and land ritual, which is designed to bring salvation to all the spirits, both those on the water and those on the land. So I would say that the different. So those are large celebrations. So the Ghost Festival, or Pudu, it has many names. The Ghost Festival, it's celebrated on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month. It's also called Pudu. It's also called Zhongyuan. There's a Taoist version of it. There is a more tantric version of it, releasing the flaming mouths. That's a seasonal festival. Then there's also the water of land and ritual, which can be performed anytime as well. But those are larger, and they involve usually ceremonies at temples, and they involve, when I say they're larger, they often involve more extensive chanting and engagement by the Sangha. So I would say the difference is one of extent or scale. The liturgies for merit making, for curing, and also for the other merit making rituals from Dunhuang usually are smaller scale operations. And that's the difference, number one. And number two, smaller scale as in fewer members of the Sangha are involved. And number two, the role of the Sangha it's not accentuated. It's there because they are, number one, they're the temple, some account at the temple receives the offering, number one. Number two, even in the direct merit-making ritual, a monk is reciting the liturgy. And in a confession ritual, usually there are more members of the Sangha there as auditors. They're there to hear and witness as well. So I would say it's one of degree, and also the Sangha is not picked out as directly in these smaller merit-making rituals.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the lady at the front.
Thank you, Professor. I have a little question about the merit-making ritual in Dunhuang. Is there any difference or similarity with the Tibetan medicine and curing rituals? When Tibetan medicine doctors and they will do rituals after they're giving drugs, giving medicine to the patients. And what's the difference, or is there a relationship?
I confess I don't know the practice of Tibetan medicine and curing well enough. I, I, I read the work of now many scholars working on Tibetan Buddhist medicine, Janet Gyatso, Francis Garrett, many and others, and then many scholars and scholars the world over. But I don't know the differences well enough. You probably do. You probably know some interesting differences. What kinds of rituals are performed around the giving of medicine? So number one, you picked out a difference. Tibetan doctors are giving medicine. In the Chinese Buddhist rituals I'm looking at, the monks are not practicing medicine, they're practicing merit only. So the question is, in addition to practicing medicine, when Tibetan doctors prescribe medicine or palpate the patient and prescribe whatever, what kinds of rituals are they also performing? That's my question back to you.
I need to further research.
I'd love to know. Let me know when you find out. Please let me know.
Yeah, sure.
It'd be a great comparative question.
I'll write to you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hardy, you have a question?
Professor Teiser, thank you. I was curious about the confession element of the ritual and just trying to get a picture of how that would play out. Were these rituals, for example, conducted by the bedside of a sick person? And because they were, they're written in the first person, so do they take part in that part of the ritual and say it themselves? Or does somebody recite it on their behalf? And then related to that, you mentioned the idea of sincerity, and I was just sort of thinking about the relationship between formulaic confessions and sincerity. And I was wondering if there's any evidence of the types of things that people are confessing for being individually tailored to the person who's, the ritual's being done for.
Yeah. Where is this done, and is the sick person there? Is it bedside? I can only give a general answer, and that is many of the rituals were performed at home. So that's interesting in and of itself. That is, you didn't, but some of the rituals were performed in temples. So that's it could be both. The fact that a batch of monks or nuns is necessary in order to witness the confession, we still don't know. That is, it could be either place. We do know a fair amount about the practice of all kinds of medicine, all kinds of healing. So in the background to this talk, which I have not dealt with, is the broader study of healing traditions in general. I mean, I touched on this somewhat in my first lecture, looking at medical practice and Taoist practice. But in fact, we know a lot beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries, just after the period I'm looking at, about how medicine was practiced, because the sources for Chinese medicine survive, and case studies survive, and examples of, I saw a patient, I went to the home, and we had this conversation, and I saw these symptoms, and I gave this prescription, and we have maybe 95 examples of that in a text, as well as did it work, did it not work. So that's really invaluable material from the perspective of a social history, which I'm interested in. It's hard to wind that back a couple centuries and say that we know for sure how it's done in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So sometimes in the home, was it at bedside? We don't know. Memorial rituals were sometimes done at bedside, and that was at the deathbed, and that's an interesting thing. Healing rituals we're not entirely certain. performance versus the formula versus the sincerity is a really interesting question. I used to think it was purely formulaic, and that's because the words are written by the liturgist. They're not supplied by the individual sick person, on the one hand, right? And the words are different for if you're a monk or a nun. The words are different if you're a lay person. The words are different if you're a government official. And there are many copies of the confession rituals, and they're all the same. These rolls are all the same. So they're not being made up each time. That's a formula. Do we even know if the sick person had to recite them? We don't know that. It's quite possible that the performer spoke all the words, that the liturgist spoke all the words. However, it is really interesting that there is the addition of these words about sincerity. So to me, that I sense that's what you were getting at. It's very interesting that despite how formulaic the specific acts are, the intention to confess having done wrong is explicitly pulled out and mentioned, right? It's put in the words of the confessor that not only whether the specific deeds I am fessing up to I actually did or not matters less than the fact that I am sincere about repenting for my past deeds, because it is about karma after all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So maybe the last question.
Thank you, Professor. On one of your earlier slides, you mentioned about, well, you went over the 38 forms of rituals, and one of them, well, a portion of them being animals like oxen and dogs.
Yeah.
Could you further expand on that? And also,
Sure.
how much of an important position did the animals play in their daily lives through what you saw from the documents?
Yeah. I'll take the ritual question first and the daily life question second. So the rituals, I was really thunderstruck more than 20 years ago when I first came across colophons. Before I started working on healing rituals, when I first came across colophons, that these are the additions after the text or before the text that describe who commissioned, who gave money to have the text copied, and it's very similar to the rites we're looking at. It's when you commission the copying of a text, when you pay to have a text copied, that is a good deed. That's making merit, and then you can dedicate the merit. You have to dedicate the merit, otherwise it floats away in effect. And so there are 5 to 10 colophons out of these 60,000 manuscripts discovered at Dunhuang that dedicate the merit to oxen. And specifically, they're lovely prayers. They're very short, and they say, I don't remember the words I'm not remembering the words exactly, but I dedicate the merit to my plowing ox who has worked years plowing the fields so I can plant apricot trees. And I hope that in his next life he will not be reborn as an ox. So these are lovely touches that again, we rarely find this kind of lower class and touching kinds of details and interesting details in medieval materials or in any kind of pre-modern materials. So the ritual, that's the way the ritual goes, so that was for colophons. This particular ritual text with the 38 sections, those are mortuary rituals. Those are for animals who have died. There's an ox, a dog, and a horse, I think, is of the 3 cases mentioned here. And those kind of follow a similar pattern to all the memorial rituals are similar, except the section where you praise the patient. Remember this section 3, where you praise the patient in the curing ritual. That section you would put in. No, these are only things we say about the family dog. These are things we only say about the horse, right? But the rest of it follows the same pattern. You can use all the other modules or sections. That's the ritual question. Animals were important domestically and for production, and especially sheep. There must be there is a sheep. I'm not sure what is it. Is it a sheep? Is it a goat? Right? What is a yang? I haven't studied that closely. My colleagues who study Dunhuang materials have, but certainly domestic animals were important because Dunhuang was less dry than it is nowadays for much of the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And it is an oasis, and so it's the parts where there is water are very lush, and there was a tremendous irrigation system and canal system there. So a lot of that took animals to help with, and certainly farming. There was a lot of grain. There was a lot of grain farmed at Dunhuang. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Professor, and thank you for all your questions. So thank you once again, Professor Teiser, for sharing your insight with us today. And could you all join me to give a big hand again to Professor Teiser?
Thank you.
So Professor Teiser will offer one more lecture this week, which will also be the last lecture of the series. It will be held this Friday, the 26th. The theme is How Curing Takes Place. So it will be held in the lecture hall where we had our last lecture, which is room 3.04 of Robenshaw Tower in Centennial Campus. So please don't miss it, and we hope to see you all again in the next lecture. Thank you, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.